Welcome once again to Sid Caudle. It's getting nearer, Sid. It's 2 weeks off now, and you've got your manifesto out there. Well, I've read the shortened version, which most people get on the doorstep, leaflets, etc. And I've read most of the longer version. How about that? My goodness me, there's more pages there than the Bible. Yes, it's very detailed and has to be commended because of that. But we're going to, the proverbial phrase, drill down on a number of things, and maybe we can reach disagreement, if that's a strange way of putting it, on a number of items. The first thing I've got to tease you about is that I found it difficult to separate this manifesto from CPA, Christian People's Alliance, and the Reform Party. Now, who's pinched what from whom?
Well, it's interesting. Yes, there are definitely similarities. But when we stood in the Mid-Bedfordshire by-election, then the Reform Party was saying, we're going to raise the tax thresholds from 12,500, which they are now, to 20,000, and we're going to substantially cut VAT. They didn't tell us how much, but we're going to substantially cut VAT. And I said, well, this is going to cost an enormous amount of money. I mean, you're talking about at least 50 billion for raising the tax threshold, and how much you're going to slash VAT by. I mean, 1p cut from 20p to or 20% to 19% is going to cost you about 7 or 8 billion. So you're going to slash it. So presumably you must be talking, if you're slashing it, at least 5%, so 20 to 15, and so you must be talking at least another 40 billion or so on top of that. So where are you going to get the money from? And they said to me, we're going to cut the budget of each government department by 5%. I thought, wow, that's ridiculous. In fact, I actually said to the guy, you'd be a lot better if you had just adopted our policies, because your policies just really don't make sense. And then they launched their manifesto yesterday, and lo and behold, they've got rid of cutting every government department by 5%, and they've put in its place, cut quangos. 50 billion, they've said.
I was particularly interested on that because it was mentioned twice, actually, if you've noticed, both by Richard Tice and Nigel Farage. So they've obviously woken up to the idea that, my goodness me, what we're spending all this money for. So that was good. But I'll tell you what, that item is halfway down your list about tax. So you want to cut from 20 to 18p in the pound for tax, as well as going up to 15,000. You've been a bit tight there, aren't you, Sid, really, only going to 15 instead of 20?
Well, what we've actually said on tax is that we're going to remove the additional social requirements for government contracts. The Adam Smith Institute have said that on that basis we could save 10%. We're now 39 billion because the total government contracts are costing 393 billion. So 10% is now 39 billion. And using that 39 billion, that's how we can cut taxes. And we've actually said we won't cut taxes unless we can actually save this money on government contracts. So the more money we save on government contracts, the more we'll cut taxes. But we've got to be responsible. We can't just say we're going to cut taxes and then hope we can find the money. I mean, you know, we're being responsible, and you have to be responsible. But our main focus is on capital spending, because it has been shown from 2010 up to 2019, when the Conservative Party managed to reduce the debt, which they did in 2010, the deficit was 140 billion. That's what they inherited. They actually got it down to less than 38 billion over to 2019, before COVID struck. So there was a reduction of 100 billion. They did it by reducing revenue spending and maintaining or increasing capital spending. That's how they did it. Now, they cut the wrong stuff, because I've shown very clearly what they should have done is to cut quangos. During that period, quangos were increasing rapidly, while they're actually cutting benefits and cutting money spent on education, and which is just totally the wrong approach. But that's what happened. But what they showed us was that by cutting revenue spending and maintaining or increasing capital spending, you get growth, and that's how you cut the deficit. So what we've actually said is we're going to cut quangos by 100 billion, and we're going to spend an additional 100 billion on capital spending. And that's what's going to bring growth. As we bring growth, we can then get more money coming in, we'll cut the deficit, and we'll also have money to cut taxes. But we've got to cut taxes responsibly. We can't do what Liz Truss did and just said, oh, we're going to cut taxes and goodness knows where we're going to get the money from. And Reform UK have now said they're going to get the money from cutting quangos. So what they've now done is produced a responsible manifesto, which it wasn't what they were saying in by-elections. What they're saying wasn't responsible, but it's now responsible. The other thing they've said, by the way, which is that they're going to get money by stopping paying interest to the banks on what they've loaned to the Bank of England. And they've said they're going to save 35 billion. I think that's irresponsible. And that's a danger of undermining the whole plate of London as the foremost financial centre in the world. Because people aren't going to loan money to the Bank of England. Banks aren't going to loan money to the Bank of England if the government turns around and says, oh, we've decided to stop paying the interest. It's just like, I'm sorry, that undermines the whole banking system. And they shouldn't do that. They really, really should not do that.
Interesting thought there. I want to go down in a logical order, and we'll probably overlap from what you just said with one or two items. But right at the top there, and I'll read this, it's important. You would like to support marriage and family by giving £12,000 grant before a marriage and £6,000 grant married couples' first child. That's 18,000, Sid. That's a lot of money. Where are you going to get that from? Is that on top of your 5%?
No, that comes from a different source, but I should actually explain that that is conditional on people going for at least 3 sessions of training stroke counselling before the marriage and before the birth of a child. So that will be an additional cost, if you like, but you do have to bear in mind that the government have said that the breakdown of marriage is costing the nation 48 billion a year. So by spending money on making marriage more stable, it will support families and actually save money in the longer run. But obviously there will be initial costs in setting it up.
It's a bit regimented, Sid. I mean, who's going to go along with that? People will say, oh, I'm not going to be bothered with that. Well, I shall not get married like the tradition has become. More people don't get married than get married. How are you going to overcome that?
Well, that's the whole idea. The whole idea is to say, right, we're going to give you a grant of £12,000 to encourage you to get married, and provided you go for the counselling. Now, obviously, anyone can turn around and say, I don't want the money, I'm not going to get married. But the point is, we want to be in a situation where it's foolish not to get married and take advantage of the grants available. See, we're not going to pass laws to say everyone must get married, no one can cohabit or something like that. I mean, it just, if you cohabit and don't get married, then you'll go to prison. We don't want that. I mean, what we want is to provide people incentives in the tax system, and that's what we're doing. Now, if people say, oh, well, I don't want to take advantage of the incentive, I want to cohabit, I don't want the 12,000, well, that's fine. Everyone is completely free to do that.
It's open to abuse, Sid, by the naughty people that will say, oh, well, there's 18 grand in this, I'm going to go along and nod me head.
Well, you do have to bear in mind, of course, it's also only for a first marriage. I mean, if someone's getting remarried, they won't be entitled to have another 6,000 or another £12,000 grant. It's only for a first child. So the idea is that it's training in what's involved in bringing up a child, which quite honestly, I found with my first child that it's like, whoa, no one actually prepares you for what it's like having a child, and there's a lot of complexities involved. And when I had my second and third child, you're a lot more prepared for what's going to hit you and what's involved. So
who would train you? You get the local vicar?
Well, obviously we'll put that out to tenders. I mean, if churches want to tender, then they're perfectly entitled to bid, but obviously we'll be open to offers for that. But we'll obviously be looking at high quality training. We don't want people to be going and wasting their time going for 3 sessions of training that is like where they come out of it and say, oh, that was an utter waste of time, that. But no, we want it to be high quality training, and it will be high quality training if we have a chance to put it into place. But no, I think over time, it will become foolish not to get married and take advantage of the grants available to have children within wedlock. And it will be to the benefit of the whole of society, without a shadow of doubt. We've allocated 3 billion to that, by the way, and before we were looking at 2.5 billion, so we've increased it by 500 million, and I believe that 3 billion will be adequate in order to finance it. The money will come out of a turnover tax, which is something else that we'll put in place.
Yeah, I was going to mention that a little bit later, because it actually is vital to what you want to do with a number of things. So before we get off this particular item, something of interest, and it's often in the small text, isn't it, at the end, that lies something a bit special. I think this could be a bit special. It says here, restore parental rights over their children's education, especially regarding RSE in schools. Now, this is vital, and a lot of people sort of overlook it. At the moment, the headmaster, headmistress has got an awful lot of power in schools and can let in strange people. In fact, 60%, it is calculated, are letting strange ideas, even in primary schools. Amplify on that, if you would, Sid.
Okay, yeah. So in the law, schools are meant to educate on behalf of parents. So parents should be involved in all aspects of what is taught in a school. Now, in practice, what this means at the moment is that you have parent governors. So parents actually elect people onto a governing body of the school where they have a say into the whole curriculum, etc. And you're also supposed to have parent meetings where the governors actually present to the parents what is going on in the school. Now, we would increase the involvement of parents so that there will be, so particularly over relationship and sex education, which is incredibly contentious. So we would actually say there has to be agreement with parents in every school over what is taught in relationship and sex education. And every parent will basically be able to tell the school what they feel about what is being taught in relationship and sex education. And the schools will have to respond to what parents say. That's because relationship and sex education is a very contentious issue, but we'd also want parental involvement in the whole of the curriculum. So see, schools should be about education. So it's about putting forward different points of view. We don't want schools to only put forward one point of view. So for instance, we don't want schools to only teach Christian ethics. But you see, we want them to teach Christian ethics accurately, and we also want them to be able to teach New Age ethics accurately and Muslim ethics accurately. So pupils know the ethical code of different sorts of religions, if you like. And that's what should happen. That is education. What tends to happen at the moment is that pupils are taught New Age ethics, which is transsexualism, homosexuality, same-sex marriage, so on and so forth. And they're told, don't let anyone tell you anything different. Your parents tell you something different. They're old-fashioned. Now that's not education. That's propaganda. And it's that we've got to move away from, and we would move away from if we were in power.
Right, excellent. Let's go on to a dear subject to everybody's hearts, the NHS. We have in the past agreed to disagree on a number of things here. One thing you're dead keen on and mention in the manifesto here is GP fund holding. Certainly it was a lot better than what we have at the moment, and that was in the 1990s. And then Blair got his hands on a lot of things, and being bold, overpaid GPs, sorted everybody out, and it's a disaster. Well, I'm going to take the reform line, Sid, because I think they've got it right. And Farage has certainly got his head up there and diagnosed it quite simply. Let's do what the French do and the Spanish and most of the Western European nations, because the NHS, and a lot of people are not going to like this, are corrupt from top to bottom. I do remember the dear old days of the year 2000 when celebrating the millennium, we got the NHS there as the holy shrine, jumping on trampolines and saying, oh, look at our nurses, how great they are. And I nearly threw something through the television. It was clear to me a long time ago, and many others, you cannot use sticking plasters on the NHS. And while GP fund holding was certainly in the right direction, you've got so much corruption, I repeat that now, highlighted perhaps by the fact that the doctors, the young doctors, have accepted north of the border a pay rise, but south of the border they're not, and they still want 35%. This is politicization. Put on top of that the absolute extraordinary destructive management and the absolute inculcation and brainwashing, and bring everybody in from every country in the world because it's going to be cheaper. The whole thing is wrong. We've got very many personal testimonies about people being treated and not being treated. Compared with the continent, it is a disaster, and it's got to be remodeled from day one. And I think Nigel Farage is absolutely right.
Okay, well, I don't, obviously. We have spoken with the Christian Medical Fellowship and talked to them about our proposals. And they've actually come back to us and said, yes, GP fund holding did work very well. And there were benefits of GP fund holding even for years after it stopped, because of the relationship that developed between the GPs and the hospitals, which became a much closer relationship under GP fund holding. Whereas at the moment, we're back to a situation now again where the two don't talk to each other. So there's clear benefits from it. And if we can reform the NHS, we should. But I think the main issue that strikes me, I know it's an issue we've talked about already, but there's 27 health quangos. And the Adam Smith Institute that's looked at it said we need no more than 9 maximum. Now, you know, we've talked about the Care Quality Commission, NHS Digital, and you go on and on and on and on. Not a single quango actually treats a patient, but they're absorbing billions and billions of money. Now, if we take money out of these quangos, I know we talked about we're going to put some of that money in capital spending, but there's still a lot of money left. Even after we've taken 100 billion out, there's still 165 billion left in quangos. We can take more money out of quangos and put them into frontline services, which is where the money really needs to be spent. And I don't mind, frankly, if some of that money goes on increasing the pay of doctors, especially junior hospital doctors that work very long hours, and you know, just to get to the lowest level of a houseman in a hospital, you've got to have done at least 5 years of intensive training. And there's not a lot of other jobs where, in order just to start on the bottom rung of the ladder, you've got to have done 5 years of intensive training. I mean, it is a very difficult profession to actually get into. I mean, obviously, once you get to the level of consultant, then you can earn an enormous amount of money. But
we're not giving the right figures at all, Sid, on this. It's all right saying that the junior doctors are paid that, but it's not true. There's lots of ancillary payments, lots of goodies they can have. Do you know that certain, all right, they've got to be doing the job for about 3 years. Certain doctors are earning close on, junior doctors, £100,000 a year. It is possible with all the extras. And we've done a comparison, for example, between Spain and the UK. And even our fully qualified doctors here are not paid as much as the junior doctors in the United Kingdom.
Yes, okay. I don't think there's a problem when people have been working for 3 years. I think the problem is when they first start in hospitals, and I think that's what the unions have been highlighting: the amount of pay that doctors get when they first qualify. So as they're literally coming from university, but they've had to do a 5-year course in university. So you went 3 years in hospitals. They've now been working for 8 years. I mean, all I'm saying is that moving money from quangos, which is don't treat a single patient, and there's 27 of them, moving that into the doctors who are actually working in the hospitals is the right process. Now, and we've got to settle the disputes. How we settle the disputes, I don't know, but we've got to settle them. We can't just carry on for year after year with doctors on strike. I mean, and
well, Labour will settle the disputes, I'll guarantee that, because they're on the same side.
Yes, okay, fine. Well, if Labour settle the dispute, good for them. But you see, the history of the Labour Party isn't that they just settle disputes. I mean, we had, as many people remember, the winter of discontent. I mean, the trade unions were completely out of control under Labour. And sometimes, when you sort of say to the unions, OK, we'll give you what you want, they then start asking for a whole lot more and keep asking more because they've got to justify for their existence. So I'm not just saying give them what they want, but all I'm saying is we've got to negotiate and come to an agreement, because we can't just carry on strike, and we've got to find money if we need to find money, and we've got to find money out of quangos. We've got to get money into the frontline services where it's really needed. That's what we're saying, and that's the process that's got to happen. It's got to happen in health, it's got to happen in education. And I'm quite convinced that we should give GP fund holding a try. It's worked before, I think it can work again. And I think that will reform the whole health system, because we get back to a situation where it's easy to get a GP appointment, which it was in the 1990s. It'll take an enormous amount of pressure off hospitals. I mean, the numbers of people now going to accident and emergency in hospitals is just phenomenal. I mean, I've been into hospital myself just recently. There must have been about 100 people waiting in accident and emergency in a hospital near me. I mean, and that is a situation where people are just totally overwhelmed. And people were on beds in corridors. There was no place for them. The majority of those 100 people, I mean, if they need to be admitted, there'll be nowhere to admit them to. I mean, that's the reality of it. But you see, ambulance drivers have said to me, 90% of the people I take to hospital don't need to go there. So 90% of those people can be treated by GPs. That's the reality, and would be treated by GPs if we had GP fund holding. They wouldn't be sent to hospital. So that's the whole system we've got to change, and we've got to give that system a chance. We can't just say, oh, we're going to scrap the NHS. We're not even going to try anything that actually worked before. Sorry, no.
Well, we certainly shouldn't be in the situation we're saying we've got it right, we invented it. That is arrogance, and it's proved our downfall. We should be doing what all other countries are doing in Western Europe, and that's have an amicable bond between a private insurance, in other words, encourage people to take private insurance out, and those that cannot afford it, then the state comes in to help out. It's simple, and it works. Now, people say, oh, what about America? Well, America is a very special place. And we shouldn't say and condemn this because America, it doesn't work exactly. It works a lot better than we are told in the news, of course, but it certainly doesn't work as good as the model works in Western Europe. There is a happy medium here, and we should follow it. In the last 15 years, Sid, we put in an enormous amount of money, more than any other country in the world, for a public health service. And we've increased the people working from 1.5 million to 2 million in that period of time. And you just can't keep pouring money and resources at it. It's not the answer.
Okay, but I mean, obviously you say, well, America's a special case, but I've seen figures that said the National Health Service is actually costing 2,300 per person in the UK, but the health system in America costs them 3,300 per person. So it actually costs them 1,000 more per person in the United States, their health system, than ours costs. And we have a National Health Service which treats everybody without restriction. So, I mean,
and half the world that come in to get treatment for free.
Okay, well, all I'm saying is that it's not true that the National Health Service is the most expensive in the world. But
no, there are special reasons surely said in America, and one of them, of course, is the fact that their training is even more arduous. That's the wrong word, but you know what I mean, than our own, and that's going to be paid for. It's the same with lawyers in America. They earn a lot of money because they spend a lot of time and pay a lot of money in for their tutorship. The biggest factor is you get a lot better treatment in the States than you do in Western Europe, especially Britain, and it's got to be paid for. But there again, we've got to move on. My goodness me, you've got something here that no other party's got, and it's got respect for life. What do you mean by that?
Okay, so we're basically saying scientifically, life starts at conception. And we believe life should be protected from conception. I mean, it's an interesting fact that you can detect a heartbeat can be detected after just 22 days of a baby's life from conception. I mean, that's actually less than 3 weeks. Normally, when they count the age of a baby, they count from the last period that the mother had. So a baby that was maybe conceived 3 weeks earlier, well, they will say is now 5 weeks. But because of the way they count it. But the truth is that after 22 days of a baby's life, a heartbeat can be detected. So you know it's alive. And the other thing that's very important is the fact that a baby has a different DNA from its mother. Because some of the things that the pro-abortionists say, it's my body, my choice. Well, we believe in a woman's right to choose. She has a right to choose whether to have sex with a man or not. But if she chooses to have sex with a man, she can't then choose to kill the baby, which may result. That's what we say. But it's not her body. And, you know, your hand doesn't have a different DNA from your foot. In fact, your hair doesn't have a different DNA from your toenail. I mean, it's just an amazing thing about DNA. But here is something that's inside you, which has a different DNA from you. So it's not your body. It's another life inside you. And that life has a right to be protected and guarded, and needs to be protected and guarded. So that's what we're saying when we say the sanctity of life from conception. And the other side, we also believe there should be a sanctity of life until death. You see, I think it's important that when you go to hospital to be treated. A hospital tries to make you better. You don't go to hospital, then the hospital says, well, I don't think this person's life is worth living, we'll just kill them. Which is, I'm afraid, what happens in some places. And you can say as much as you like, oh, it would only be done with permission of the person concerned. But there's a lot of people during their life that said, oh, I don't want to live anymore. I mean, and it's just incredible. I mean, you've got countries like Belgium, for instance, that there was a man in his 40s who had a sex change operation and didn't go very well. And he said, I want to die. So rather than actually saying, oh, come on, you know, we can help you, we've got to help you come to terms with what's happened or whatever, they said, okay, fair enough, well, we'll kill you then. And they just killed him. I mean, that is what they call assisted dying, but it's horrendous. And in Canada, where they also have this assisted dying, they're even killing children, you know, because a child says, oh, this child's disabled, their life isn't worth living, let's just kill them. I mean, it's horrible, horrible. And as far as we're concerned, we are totally opposed to assisted dying. God will decide when people die, not man. Or God, you know, and God knows best, I'm afraid.
I think you've touched on something here that's very important, Sid. And it's not just the euthanasia bit. It's, to quote, the Liverpool pathway. It's type in the NHS. This will certainly help with bed blocking. And there has been, and still is, many examples where a little bit of an overdose of the morphine will help the patient. Really? Now, it goes on, has gone on for years, and this is a problem with a national health service, not with but with a national health service, because who knows what an individual doctor or nurse thinks. And it's horrible. And it happens so many times. And we've interviewed many people that have lost their parents and loved ones like this. Doctor knows best. Nurse knows best. No, they don't. It's a great method, I repeat, to get over the bed blocking. You wouldn't get that in a private hospital, even though it be, oh, we'll have another month's money out of this person, but at least they try to maintain life. That may be a positive for the old private medicine.
You know, so it is an interesting point, but you do have to bear in mind that if a hospital decides to give an overdose of morphine because they consider that this person's life isn't worth living, then that is illegal, I'm afraid. So
it is, but it goes on the whole time, Sid.
Well, it can be stopped and it should be stopped, but I understand. I mean, what we're talking about, because I know when my mother died when she was 93, and she spent some time in hospital, and she went into hospital and went into a ward where people were expected to recover. But then later on in her life, she went into a ward where people weren't expected to recover. And literally in that particular ward, they just really didn't bother with the people very much because they weren't expected to live. So I know that goes on, and it's not necessarily giving them a dose of morphine. It can be the sort of do not bother to resuscitate sort of approach. Yeah, I guess it is different if you've got a private hospital where they're being paid enormous amounts of money for the person to be in the hospital. They want them to carry on living as long as possible. But I think we need some balance between the two approaches, quite honestly.
What about IVF, Sid? What's your view on IVF?
Well, it's a difficult area, but you see, you understand a situation where there's a married couple that want to have children, and they haven't been able to conceive naturally, so they want to have some medical help to try and get to conceive. And sometimes if you can actually fertilize an egg outside of the womb and implant it into the woman, then I don't see anything wrong with that, quite honestly, but I think it can be obviously misused. If it's misused to give children to people that aren't married and aren't in stable relationships, then I think that's wrong.
Yeah, two things that have happened. One, this very day, the Southern Alliance of Churches in America, they blow with the wind, but they suddenly become against IVF big time, which is quite a surprise for their recent behavior. The other thing that is happening, again in the States, and I suspect in many other countries as well, is that eugenics are creeping in here, and you can actually now, because of scientific advances, you can select the most likely baby, the healthiest baby, the baby that has an opportunity of going to university. You can even tell how bright that child will be, what his IQ will be. Now that is frightening. I repeat the word eugenics, and this is coming from IVF. It's difficult territory. You're dead right, Sid. One of our children desperately needed help and have got help this way. The child is wonderful.
Yes. Yes, it is a difficult area. I mean, I don't support eugenics at all. You know, I believe that God has created this amazing way in which a man and a woman can come together and produce a child. And a man and a woman coming together to produce a child is a wonderful thing. And God's plan and God's design is that it only happens inside a marriage so that there is stability for the child. I mean, you know, that's God has created this wonderful thing, which I sometimes refer to as like a plug and a socket, because it is very much like that. It's like, you know, two plugs, it doesn't do the work. And two sockets, it doesn't do the work. You've got to have a plug and a socket. And a plug and a socket, it works. Lo and behold, you've got electricity. And it's very similar to that with a man and a woman. That's how God has made us, and that's how God's created us. And we have to honor God's creation. Now, I know with modern scientific advances, we can do other things, but we've got to be very, very careful with how we use them.
You're supporting a crisis pregnancy situation like the good old days, not quite like the first good old days when you were ostracized from your village. Woman that is pregnant has to be looked after. Deep psychological problems here that come out. How would you do that on a state basis?
Well, you know, in any society, there will always be people who, for one reason or another, have not gone down the channel which we'd like them to go down. You see, what we're trying to do in our manifesto is to make it more likely that people will get married and children will be born within wedlock and they will be cared for by their natural parents for the whole of their lives. We want to make that more likely. Now, there'll always be situations where, for one reason or another, I mean, it can be a situation where one of the parents is killed, one of the parents tragically dies. I mean, it doesn't have to be because of divorce or breakup, although I guess divorce and breakup is more likely. But we want to make that less likely by helping people to think about what's involved. And that's what the whole idea of the training is like, to make divorce less likely. And by the way, we'd also go back to the divorce laws, which operated before they introduced this no-fault divorce, because it was actually a good idea that you could only get divorce after you'd had 2 years separation by agreement or 5 years separation if there's no agreement. And it was always possible for one of the couples to object to the divorce. And the courts were like, encouraged people to try and stay married. Now we've got this no-fault divorce. We've got a situation where anyone can just turn around and say to their husband or to their wife, I've decided that marriage is not working. I've decided I want to divorce you. And in the matter of just a few weeks or months, the divorce can go through and everything's finalized. And this actually leads to divorce regret in some situations, which is like, but I guess if couples come back together again, then that's a good thing. But we should. Marriage isn't always easy. Relationships aren't always easy. So the state should be given help and support to encourage family stability, and that has to be our process. Yes, I mean there'll always be some that end up being single parent families, and we must always support single parent families. We don't go round with a big finger wagging and saying you shouldn't this or you shouldn't that. Of course, where there's failure we have to support it, but we've got to make failure less likely, not more likely.
It has become almost fashionable to be a single parent family. Look what I can do as a woman. I can bring that child up just as well as though we were a married couple. Agree with that?
Well, in some quarters, there's the idea of, I don't need a man, but, they do need a man to conceive. But, so I don't need a man to bring up my child. I think that's a mistake. I think it's a big mistake. And I think undoubtedly a child benefits from being with a mother and a father, undoubtedly.
Okay, we're going to actually cut things in half because we've got another couple of things to mention before we finish. Time has gone, and to do justice to the whole program you've got set out here, we'll do part 2 next week. But to the last item I've got here that leads us to 50% of the document is to fight poverty and homelessness, and especially to get rid of this wretched 5-week waiting period for benefits. I had no idea, Sid, it cost £12 billion for that. No wonder they set a limit on that. They were saving themselves money, weren't they?
Oh, absolutely. And Ian Duncan Smith, who was at the time when it was introduced, was in charge, said, I don't want this 5-week waiting period, but I've been forced by the Treasury, which at the time was George Osborne, I've been forced to introduce it. Because they've cut my budget. And that's what he actually said. So he didn't want it to be there, but what actually happened is that people have been forced to go to food banks or even encouraged by the state to go to food banks because, you'll have to wait 5 weeks. Here's some vouchers to go to your food bank to get some food in the meantime. And it's quite honestly, it's wrong. It's totally wrong that the state is sending people to charitable food banks in order to live. And it's also shocking to me, frankly, that restoring those cuts has not been in the Labour or Lib Dem manifestos, because to me that's almost basic. That that's the first thing they should be actually saying. Well, if we come to power, we'll restore these cuts to benefits. We'll get rid of this 5-week waiting period because it's wrong. But they haven't. You see, I think the reason has been that, we want to spend money on other things that are more popular. I mean, these people are on benefits will probably vote Labour anyway, so we don't need to be spending lots of money to help them. But that's a bad approach. A bad approach should be we're going to deal with the greatest need. And that is undoubtedly one of the greatest need. And it's a great tribute, I think, to the CPA that we've got that in our manifestos. We've said how we'll pay for it. We'll pay for it out of a turnover tax. And it's a very, very important in society to have that dealt with.
Significant, of course, if you're an illegal immigrant, you don't have to wait for 5 weeks, do you? There again, we'll come again at the end of this statement. This part of the statement says about sheltering people overnight sleeping. We've just got hold of some figures that have not been published yet, but we have them from a major city in the United Kingdom. Rough sleeping has increased exponentially in the last couple of years. No reasons given. Do you have a reason for that, Sid?
Well, I think you'd have to look at the figures very carefully, because obviously during COVID, there was nobody sleeping rough because they literally just put everyone in hotels. So obviously when COVID ended and that support ended, but some people were then going back onto the streets. But if you compare the number of sleeping on the streets in 2019 with the number of sleeping this year, that's an accurate comparison. And I think you would get true figures. If you just look at the last 2 years, I think you get distorted figures because of COVID.
It's known, of course, that a lot of the people on the streets have got mental health problems. A lot have got drug problems. And that's a science of its own, how to deal with these people.
No, absolutely. But that's why we're actually saying, okay, we'll give you a free overnight shelter with accommodation, and we'll give you a free meal. You don't have to pay anything, because if once you start saying, we'll give you cheap, or, it's like then say, oh no, I'm not going, I haven't got the money. But if you say it's completely free, then there's no reason why people shouldn't go and take advantage of what's being provided free of charge.
Well, there's a proportion, Sid, that actually choose to be on the street, because they can beg for more money and make a good living, inverted commas, out of it, or that they're just used to it. And if they've got mental problems, perhaps they would feel more comfortable on the street.
Yeah, well, okay, but anyone can take advantage of free. To see, this has been, what we're saying here has actually been provided by Christian charities, and I've been myself to a night shelter for the homeless, which has just been provided by a Christian charity with a free meal, and I've even spoken to the people there. And you see, the thing is, when you have a night shelter with a free meal for people, homeless do come. And because it's laid on free of charge, and you can actually start to talk to them and work with them and say, right, why are you on the streets? What can we do to help you? And you can start to solve the problem. You can't solve the problem by just going and talking to people that are on the streets. It doesn't work, because they'll probably say, oh, go away, leave me alone.
But over what duration would you be able to deal with this? Would it be a fortnight? Would be the maximum stay?
Well, no, not necessarily. I mean, but you'd have to, in every case, you'd have to literally get alongside the person involved and find out why they're on the streets and what's happened. I mean, it could be marital breakdown. I mean, I've been thrown out of my house, but it could be, sometimes it's ex-prisoners, because you find people come out of prison and they're told by probation, you can't go back to your family because you're dangerous, you're a threat to your children, you're not allowed to go back there. So where am I supposed to go? Well, we'll try and find a place in a hostel. But it's they might not be happy in the hostel. Sometimes there's a lot of drugs in the hostel, so they actually prefer to sleep on the streets. But the other thing, of course, is when people go into prison, if people given a 2-year sentence in a prison, if they're living in rented accommodation on their own, when they come out of the prison, that rented accommodation is not there anymore. They haven't actually got anywhere to go to live in some cases. So that's one reason why people are on the streets. Now, if you're finding that, okay, we've got an ex-prisoner who's on the streets because they've got nowhere to live, you can actually say, right, let's work with them, let's help them and support them. Because you see, one of the other things that happened, as we've highlighted, is the fact that, if people come out of prison and they're just thrown on the streets, they're a lot more likely to reoffend. I mean, that's why reoffending is 38%. When if you work, support, help them, then Christian charities have got reoffending down below 10%. So which is a win for everybody. But in every case, you need to find out why people are on the streets, what's the cause of it, what can we do to help them? And in most cases, you can do something to help.
Right, we have got a couple of supplementaries before we close. The Farage man, via reform, clearly stated today that he wants to get the BBC out the way, scrap the licence fee. And from what's happened to my listening this morning, where the BBC were doing their usual take on the news, it was truly awful. It was so left-wing bias as not to be true. Everything was skewed to the left. There's always an item on the doom of global warming. They were pretty desperate this morning, and this is a major news item, according to the BBC, that somebody from the committee in Paris for the Paralympics, incidentally, we find out, of course, that he's also on another committee about climate change, has said, oh, we're all going to die. That when the temperature gets to 34 degrees, all the disabled people will have heart attacks, you name it, that will happen. The Paralympics is going to suffer, and it's all your fault for not supporting climate change. Sid, the worm is not for turning. Is Nigel correct? Get rid of the BBC.
Well, we don't necessarily have to get rid of the BBC, but we can stop funding the BBC. The BBC can look for funding elsewhere. I mean, you know, it's but yeah, we should stop funding the BBC from the state, because the BBC has been pursuing a very left-wing agenda, as you say. But you also referred to it in terms of climate change. You see, we had a hustings here in Hitchin last night, and the climate came up, not least because I brought it up in my introductory remarks. But it was something that was talked about throughout the process. But when you say that, for instance, I mean, I actually said to them, you know, the Clean Air Acts, reducing the amount of smoke and smog over cities, was obviously very welcome. And what we had to do with the ozone layer, with the chlorofluorocarbons, you know, which were causing problems. I said they're obviously very necessary to stop the hole in the ozone layer. But I've said what we've done in reducing carbon emissions, I said, and in this country, we've actually got renewable energy right up to 41%, one of the highest in the world. I said, there's no evidence that all that work has actually made any difference to the climate at all. But, you know, they don't like you saying that. It's like, boo, boo, boo. But I mean, but they can't actually say what you're saying is not true, because
well, no, you're right. And the young people especially, which leads us on to the next question, finally. Starmer said, right, 16-year-olds, you can vote. Now, we're not surprised. 90% of 16-year-olds will vote Labour. People are now starting to say they're going to be in power for a generation, never mind 5 years. The young people are very influenced by social media. And at 16, have they got the depth of knowledge and understanding to commit themselves to a particular party at that age? There's lots of other things in Labour's hidden manifesto that are equally sinister. Maybe we can talk about that next week. But certainly this is blatant manufacture. Talk about moving boundaries. No comparison between what Sir Keir is doing here, is it?
No, and the reality is, the reason they're talking about reducing the voting age to 16 is that they think the majority of 18-year-olds will vote Labour. So they think it's to their advantage. Just as Biden in America is allowing all the immigrants to come in and vote in the elections. It doesn't matter how long you've been, doesn't matter if you got here illegally, you can still vote, because he thinks they're all going to vote Democrat. And that is wrong. Very, very wrong. It's an abuse of the electoral process.
Right, we can't disappoint the viewers, and we've got to mention the European Cup. The first match, Scotland, Germany, a good one. Who are you supporting?
Well, you know, you can't say every match that you watch you're supporting one team necessarily, but I was obviously interested in Scotland's performance, and I must admit I found their goalkeeper to be very, very substandard. I mean,
they've got history there, Sid.
Oh, well, certainly several of those goals, you think, well, how on earth did he not save that one? And of course, if you've got a substandard goalkeeper, it can affect the whole team, because the team can just think, oh, what's the point? You know, as soon as they attack, all they've got to do is just put in a shot and it's going to go in the goal because the goalkeeper's useless. Well, if you've got a very good goalkeeper, it can give the whole team confidence, because it's like, doesn't matter what happens, you know, we're not going to concede, so let's just go forward and attack. And as long as we can score one goal, we can win. And if you've got that mentality, then the team's going to perform better. So I think that's my opinion, looking at Scotland, that the thing that let them down most was a very inadequate goalkeeper.
The reason why I'm asking this, Sid, is tribalism. Now, I watched that match as, speaking honestly, as a neutral, quite enjoyed it. Now, that's one stage less than being a supporter of Scotland. But let me tell you, the Scots and the Welsh would never support England, the majority. There's this thing of tribalism. But the Brits, I mean the English Brits, of course, would quite readily support Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland, whoever. What is it with the outliers in our country that they would sooner see England be done down? They don't want to see them in the tournament, let alone win it.
Well, yes, but I guess it's a little bit like Man United and Man City and Arsenal and Tottenham. You know, it's like, even though they're neighbours in London, it's like Arsenal hate Tottenham and Tottenham hate Arsenal, which is a bit nonsense, really. Frankly, the whole thing is nonsense. But I enjoy watching the football, and I watched most of the England match, and I thought certainly in the first half England played very well, and you know, I think it's a good foundation for the tournament. But it looks at the moment as though all the favourites are doing quite well. We're not actually having a lot of shocks, so maybe that's how modern football is going, you know, that it's so much more scientific, and the clever teams know how to play, and they're going to come to the top.
I think we can learn a lot from football and compare it with politics, the tribalism of both, connivance of both, Machiavellian connivance of both. It's a fascinating comparison. We're in unusual times, Sid. Everything's coming together, the perfect storm. What will happen to England? What will happen to Gareth when they lose again? What will happen to Rishi when he almost certainly will lose? It's not going to be boring, Sid, but one fears for the outcome of both competitions.
Well, we have to wait and see. See, one thing, you know, we started off this programme talking about reform. And one of the things which I find strange, frankly, I mean, is Nigel Farage goes and launches manifesto and tells the world, we're not going to win. We're not here to win. We're here to be the opposition, because Labour are going to win. And it's all a foregone conclusion. But, you know, my experience is that there's no great enthusiasm for Labour. I think people have had enough of the Conservatives and they want change. But people aren't desperate to get a Labour government in. And I think there's a door open there for Farage. I mean, we had an opinion poll where they were in front of the Conservatives. And I think he would have gained a lot more traction if he'd actually said in that manifesto launch that, you know, we're now ahead of the Conservatives. It's now between us and Labour, and we're now going for Labour because, you know, we want to run this country. The Labour Party will be a disaster. And if he'd taken that approach and said, we want to run the country, I think he'd have got a lot more traction than saying, there's no way we're going to win this election. You know, we're just here to make up the opposition. I mean, frankly, I think that's a mistake. But Nigel Farage, right across the board, has been very poor at that sort of strategy.
Could be honest, Sid. That's strange in politics, isn't it?
Well, I don't think it is honesty. I think it's pessimism, frankly. I mean, it's like he predicted that they were going to lose the EU referendum in 2016. Oh, we're not going to win, he said. We're not going to win. You know, I think we'll do well, but we're not going to win. But he did win. And then when he won, he said, "Oh, my life's ambition achieved. I'm going home now." But no, I think I think I think that's been the wrong approach. I think it was the wrong approach in 2016 to tell the world we're not going to win. I think it was the wrong approach when launched his manifesto to say all we're trying to do is to be an effective opposition. I don't think it was honesty. I think it was pessimism.
Well, what perhaps Rishi has done us a favour calling the early election on the 4th of July instead of waiting until November, even January. We won't have to wait long for the truth. Sid, we'll face you next week with the second half of your manifesto. Thank you so much.
Thank you.